transforming the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, overcoming obstacles to develop biodiversity baseline data in the small island developing states. My name is Marion Marigot. I work at UNDP. I'm a technical specialist for the 6 National Reports to CBD project. Today, I will be your facilitator for this webinar, together with my colleague Diego Ochoa, communication advisor, and Annie Verning, UNDP coordinator for UN Biodiversity Lab. And I also have with me Leah Phillips, program assistant with the Nature for Development program at UNDP as the organizing team. So I want to first thank you all for being with us today. I know the world is adapting to the new normal, which includes working from home and often facing a weaker internet connection and many technical challenges. So thank you for making the effort to be with us today. Most importantly, our organizing team and guests with us really hope that you're in good health and that your families, friends, and colleagues are doing well in these difficult times. So before we begin, I want to highlight just a few things. If you have any technical issues, you can send a private Zoom message to Diego Ochoa or email him at diego.ochoa@undp.org. I think you see his email address on the screen. He can help you to resolve any issues as quickly as possible, and I'm asking you, please do not use the group chat for that because it's a bit disruptive. Your microphones are all muted for now during the presentation to ensure that the speaker can be heard clearly. But if you want to ask a question, you have 2 options. You can either type your questions in the Zoom chat box so we can collect those questions and make sure we address them during the Q&A sessions. Or during the discussion itself, you can virtually raise your hand in the control panel and we will open your microphone during the Q&A if the connection allows it. I encourage you to turn on your video if the bandwidth allows it when you speak. It's always better to have a face instead of just a voice and makes it more human. I also want to let you know that today's presentation have all been pre-recorded. So instead of having live presentation, we will play a recording of the videos. The goal is to minimize really as much as possible any technical difficulties. And then we will upload all of the presenters' videos and presentation on the NBSAP Forum YouTube channel. And Diego, I think, is going to drop the link in the chat. And we all share the presentation on the NBSAP Forum itself. We have also created a dedicated page on the NBSAP Forum for the SIDS on spatial data to continue this conversation whenever you want with your peers to share relevant resources, the questions that you have, and we're hoping that we can keep having this discussion after the webinar. So Diego, if you can also drop the link for the SID section, it's awesome. So today we will go through a couple of presentations. So first we will focus on the lessons learned from the 6NR project. This presentation is made by Prudence Rain, who's also a technical specialist for the 6NR project, and Anthony Camo, UNEP's project manager for the 6NR project. We will then hear from Annie Verning, so UNDP coordinator for UN Biodiversity Lab, and Scott Atkinson, the UNDP spatial data planner, on why and how spatial data is a powerful tool to help monitor and report on biodiversity, and also focus on the data sets available for the SIDS. We will then hear from Keisha Garcia, who wrote the 6NR for Trinidad and Tobago, who will give us more insight on the project and highlight how spatial data helped writing the 6NR and some recommendations for the future. Keisha is with us today, so thanks, Keisha. And finally, we also hear from Li Jikai, Program Management Officer at the CBD Secretariat, who will provide some insight on the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. All right, well, let's turn over to our first presentation. So as you know, the SIDS have some of the most diverse and unique ecosystems in the world and are home to a host of rare endemic species, and we must ensure their conservation and protection. Biodiversity is also an important contributor to the livelihood in many SIDS, as industry like tourism and fisheries can constitute over half of the GDP in small island countries. Moreover, many of the threats to biodiversity, such as unsustainable fishing and agriculture practices or pollution, poaching, habitat destruction, are often addressed in the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan, the NBSAPs, but they remain important challenges due to the lack of adequate capacity and data to efficiently implement and monitor national conservation action. Additional difficulties on top of that arise in the coordination of stakeholders and in the sharing and the use of up-to-date spatial data and non-spatial data on biodiversity. So for our first presentation, with this in mind, we're going to focus on the lessons learned from the 6th National Report to CBD project. I will turn over to my colleagues Prudence and Anthony to remind you the context of this project, explain how we worked with the SIDS, and spend a bit of time exploring the lessons learned. So Prue and Anthony, please, over to you.
Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Kamau. I'm UNEP's project manager for the 6th National Report. I'm based in Nairobi and I'll be giving this presentation today with my colleague Prudence Rain.
Hi everyone, I'm Prudence Rain and I'm working with UNDP as a technical specialist for the 6th National Report project, and I will be giving this presentation from Auckland, New Zealand.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you Marion for the introduction. As Marion has mentioned before, we are going to dedicate the next 15 to 20 minutes to the lessons learned from the 6th National Report to the Convention on Biological Diversity project. It is important to start with the webinar, by focusing on the 6th National Report project, to give a brief reminder of what the project was about, its objectives, but also understand better how we have worked with the small islands developing states and what lessons we can draw from the experience. So, to start, what is the 6th National Report to the CBD project? The 6th National Report project, funded by the GEF and implemented by UNEP and UNDP, provide support to 137 parties to the convention in preparing their high quality, data-driven, and gender-responsive national reports. The goal was to support countries to produce their 6 national reports and submit to the Secretariat of the CBD. The national report not only focused on the implementation of national biodiversity and action plans, they also allow us to assess progress towards achieving the global Aichi biodiversity targets and related national targets. Also, they help contribute in the preparation of the 5th version of the Global Biodiversity Outlook and inform the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The implementation of the project started early in 2017, late in 2017, early in 2018, with a few Pacific islands beginning actual work in 2019. And since then, our teams at UNEP and UNDP, together with colleagues from the CBD Secretariat, have had a lot from the SIDS and their challenges in monitoring and reporting on biodiversity. Most of the participants to the webinar today are aware of this project since they took active part in it and received support from either UNDP or UNEP. So why do we focus on the small island states today while the project is a global project? Out of the 137 eligible countries, 38 are SIDS and have received direct support from the implementing agencies for the past 2.5 years to prepare and in most cases submit their national reports. The SIDS are home to unique biodiversity and ecosystems, but also face unique challenges, especially when it comes to conservation, development, and tackling climate change issues. Under this project, the implementing agencies hosted 2 regional workshops for the SIDS. The first one was hosted in Apia, Samoa, back in 2018, September, while the second one was hosted in Bridgetown, Barbados, later in the month of January 2019. while the first one aggregated countries from the Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The second one was attended by representatives from the Caribbean countries. During these workshops and during the one-on-one support and including during international meetings, we realized that the SIDS face similar challenges and often came up with same solutions, and therefore were able to exchange best practices among peers. Here are group photos from the two workshops hosted with the SIDS in 2018 and in 2019. The SIDS play a key role in protecting and conserving biodiversity and ecosystems, and we should therefore learn from their experience and expertise. Indeed, the SIDS have some of the most diverse and unique ecosystems in the world. For instance, the Caribbean region has 10% of the world's coral reef and no less than 1,500 species of fish and marine mammals. On the other hand, the Pacific region is home to about 500 threatened species, for instance, Fiji's endangered iguanas. Island biodiversity refers to the unique variation of organisms in an ecosystem. This is mostly due to the isolation of islands, which result in greater concentration of endemic species. This biodiversity exists nowhere else on Earth, including flora, fauna, and microorganisms. Islands thought as biodiversity hotspots have been regarded as making the greatest contribution to global biodiversity proportional to their size, as they contain some of the richest reservoirs of plants and animals on Earth. Thank you.
Biodiversity is an important contributor to the livelihoods in many SIDS, and the SIDS are the illustration of the interconnectivity between nature and human development. While recognizing unique species and ecosystems are found in the SIDS, it is important to reflect on the difficulties brought up by the SIDS themselves. Indeed, not only are SIDS affected by economic and development difficulties similar to other countries, they also have their own particular characteristics that lead to specific vulnerabilities and difficulties, including their small size, remoteness, narrow resource and export base, exposure to shocks, as well as impacts of climate change, and more intense and more frequent natural disasters. We see today that SIDS are impacted by COVID-19, which have not only consequences on the population, but also on the biodiversity in the countries. Working from home has been for most colleagues a challenge, so we are even more grateful that you are here with us today. Based on this specific context and during the implementation of the 6NR, our teams were able to connect with most of you and collect a few lessons learned. 4 are displayed on the screen now. First, the achievements of national targets during the implementation of the MBSAP in the SIDS are measured against a baseline, which unfortunately does not exist in many cases, or is not collected and represented geographically. Second, there are significant gaps in biodiversity data in these countries, which contrast with the richness and biodiversity itself. SIDS are working on and need support to develop baseline spatial data before they can begin monitoring progress to achieve national biodiversity targets and ABTs. Third, and continuing with spatial data, SIDS recognize spatial data is a powerful tool to monitor and report on biodiversity target achievement, as it allows a broad range of decision makers to visualize the distribution and changes in biodiversity, the associated causes and related impacts of actions taken to implement the MBSAP and Sustainable Development Plans. The SIDS need further support in addition to what has been done already in the 6NR. My colleague Annie Bernig will tell you more in a few minutes. To keep improving in-house GIS capacity and generate collect, and systematically use spatial data to monitor and report on biodiversity. And 4, there is an urgent need to support GEF-eligible SIDS to develop baselines so that they can more effectively measure the impacts of implementation of NBSAP, but also to implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and monitor any resulting changes to biodiversity statuses and trends over time. Based on the lessons learned and discussions with the SIDS, we have determined a couple of action points and important activities for the next few months and years. Countries must build in-house data management mechanisms and spatially explicit monitoring systems that allow them to systematically collect, share, and analyze data during national reporting, NBSAP development, and implementation. Countries must also refine their biodiversity indicators, especially in their NBSAPs, to track measurable changes in the status of nature and the impact of actions to protect it. The indicators should also better reflect the contribution of all stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples, local communities, and women, and ensure that all impacts are measured in a consistent way. Countries are also looking to obtain political support in accessing, sharing, and using spatial data for better decision-making. SIDS will and should continue to receive access to training and capacity building activities on spatial data after the submission of the 6NR, either to update their NBSAP or prepare the next round of national report in a few years. It will be important for the countries to work with data providers to update the NBSAP or prepare the next round of national report in a few years. It will be important for the countries to work with data providers to update global databases with accurate and nationally validated data, which will be used to develop the national baselines for biodiversity data. Lastly, SIDS need to develop, access, and share spatial data and use it to make decisions, and need to better capture important biodiversity data from Indigenous and local communities, and to understand the different roles of women and men in conservation. With this in mind, we have several objectives for this webinar. While we acknowledge all these issues will not be solved with just one webinar session, we hope that this webinar will be an occasion for stakeholders to exchange and reflect on the following: how to overcome obstacles and develop effective long-term spatially explicit monitoring systems to better monitor the implementation of national plans and their impact on biodiversity. How to better capture important biodiversity data from Indigenous and local communities, and to understand the different roles of stakeholders in biodiversity conservation. And also to understand what is the UN Biodiversity Lab and its existing available features to upload national data sets and access and share and use spatial data to support action planning. And of course, to open discussions on possible ways to develop information for national baselines of biodiversity data. This list is not exhaustive, and of course, we are hoping you will use this webinar and the NBSAP forum to keep the conversation going afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention and also your participation in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Prudence and Anthony, for that representation summarizing the lessons learned from the 6NR project. So for you to know, we have a very packed schedule for this webinar, but I would like to take maybe the next 5 minutes to open the floor for questions on the 6NR project. So I remind you, you can raise your hand on the control panel, or you can also type your questions and we can read it. We have the possibility to take questions in English, French, and Spanish, so feel free to ask the question in the language you're the most comfortable with. So I think we will have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, if anyone has any. Right, I'm giving a bit of time for people to type or raise their hand if they have any questions on the 6NR. If you don't have any questions coming to your mind right now, but they come later, it's totally fine. Please feel free to type them on the chat box. So I see, has a methodology, so we have a question from Janelle. Has a methodology or baseline data collection strategy been created to assist the SID collect the necessary baseline data? No, and that's the whole point of the webinar today. So we have understood from the interactions that we had with the SIDS in many workshops that Anthony mentioned, that there is this need to come up with more systematic consultation among stakeholders and collection and use of spatial data, right? But the countries in itself do not necessarily find a way to do so. So what we did is to create opportunity for dialogue in between stakeholders, because as implementing agencies, international implementing agencies, there is so much we can do in forcing stakeholders to discuss. What we can do though is to offer platforms. So we have the NBSAP forum to really have those stakeholder engaging. In the next presentation, you will see Annie talking about UN Biodiversity Lab and why a platform on spatial data can be relevant even if you're using national data vs global data. So there is not necessarily one way to come up with a systematic collection of data in the SIDS. It's also interesting and yet challenging to take into account the specific context of the different SIDS, because the SIDS have similar context, and let's say in challenges, but yet we should take into account the very specific national context. So I hope, Janil, this is answering your question. I take another question from Andrea. You're welcome, Janil. How do non-JEP eligible SIDS benefit from and contribute to this initiative? For instance, the Caribbean overseas country and territories. So it's true that for now, we've been working mostly with JEP eligible countries for the 6NR project. Only JEP eligible countries could receive the support from UNDP or UNEP. That being said, moving forward, we're really determined to provide support as much as possible to all countries if possible. And we are offering the possibility to use some of the tools. So again, NBSAP forum or the UN Biodiversity Lab to use spatial data, to aggregate those spatial data, and to have stakeholder engaging with each other. I think those two questions from Andrea and Janil actually are a natural transition to the next presentation. And I just want to make sure that you have in mind the presentation from Annie on UN Biodiversity Lab and spatial data and the available data sets to then having a longer Q&A session where we can elaborate a little bit. So I see there's more questions coming in the chat. Keep sending them. We are looking at them and then collecting them. I will try to answer them during the next presentation when it's playing. And if we don't have time to answer them during this webinar session, we'll be in touch afterwards because we have your email address now that you're registered, so we can be in touch with you. So I want to jump to the next presentation. And so as we explained, one of the obstacles of the SIDS is to have access to data, spatial data in particular, to report on the implementation of national plans, right? And UNDP and UNEP have worked together a lot to make spatial data available for decision makers to facilitate the process of reporting, and hopefully this process will become easier in the future. So to talk a bit more about spatial data, I want to turn over to my colleague Annie Verning. Again, she's the UNDP coordinator for UN Biodiversity Lab, and is with us today, so she'll be able to take a few questions on the platform after her presentation. So Annie, over to you.
Hello, my name is Annie Vernig, and I coordinate UN Biodiversity Lab for the United Nations Development Program. Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So in this short presentation, I'll first provide some framing around why we at UNDP see spatial data as so essential to global priorities around biodiversity and sustainable development. I'll then introduce some of the work we've done around our UN Biodiversity Lab platform and show how this might be relevant to SIDS. And I'll wrap up by talking about some of our next steps and new projects that we're really excited to share. All right, let's get started. So let me start with a very basic question. Why is spatial data important? And I want to answer this question by taking a step back and painting a picture of our world today. No matter where we work, no matter where we look, we are confronting a profound unraveling of the planet. If we look to the landmark report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we see that we have now only 10 years to take action to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. The parallel report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, released just last year, showed that we're seeing unparalleled declines in biodiversity, with over 1 million species at risk of extinction. These twin threats, loss of biodiversity and climate change, are some of the defining issues of our time, with cascading ripple effects, including what we're seeing all around us today with the current COVID-19 pandemic. So as we're confronted with these issues, how can we take tangible action? For us, this is where spatial data comes in. We see spatial data as a powerful tool that can identify both where and how we can take action on biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development. Not only this, but spatial data can provide us with key tools for monitoring and transparency around efforts worldwide to achieve key international agreements such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Nature-Based Sustainable Development Goals. However, despite this power of spatial data to support action and to monitor the impacts of these actions, at UNDP we found there to be a gap between the potential for spatial data and the ability of policymakers to actually use it. So let me tell you a little story. This is based on an analysis we conducted back in 2018. So imagine I am your average government policymaker, and I'm looking at my country's national biodiversity plan to try to identify where I can take action for nature. On average, I'll find 4 maps in this plan, and one of these maps will be the political boundaries of my country itself. So this isn't very many. This is very few, especially when we compare with the massive amounts of spatial data that are being generated at national and global levels. So what's the gap? Why isn't spatial data making it into these key plans or into the equivalent reports under the Convention on Biological Diversity? We set out to answer this with the countries that we work with. So in 2018, we conducted a needs assessment with over 60 parties to the CBD, asking them why spatial data wasn't being used to implement and report on their commitments to the convention. And they came back with 4 very clear answers. First, data are inaccessible. They're often fragmented between different ministries or data providers and require complex data sharing agreements. Second, even if they are accessible, some data are not usable. This might be because they're out of date, because they're too coarse of resolution, or a variety of other issues. Third, accessible, usable data may not be nationally validated. And this is incredibly important for some of the governments we work with. In order to be used for government purposes, data must be officially validated for use. It could be the best data set in the world. If it hasn't gone through this process, it cannot be used by government. And finally, the 4th obstacle was that even for data that are accessible, usable, and validated, many governments lack the capacity to be able to access, analyze, and use the data in meaningful ways to meet their priorities. So what we found here was really a gap between the potential for spatial data to be used and the capacity of policymakers to actually use it. So I want to take a moment here and use one of these cool Zoom features to launch a poll. So you should see this popping up on your screen. I'm curious to know, out of our participants here today, how many of you have encountered some of the issues that I described here? So I'll give you about 20 seconds to add in your responses and submit them, and then I'll share back the responses with the group. You can select one or multiple answers to this poll. All right. So it seems like at least some of you are experiencing similar issues in your countries. So as we thought about how to work with countries to increase access and use of spatial data, UNDP and UN Environment issued a challenge to all parties. We asked them to double the number of maps between their 5th national report and their 6th national report to the Convention on Biological Diversity. But we didn't issue this challenge in a vacuum. We've launched a wide range of capacity building activities and our flagship spatial data platform, UN Biodiversity Lab. So for most of the remainder of this presentation, I'll give you a quick overview of the functionalities available through UN Biodiversity Lab and talk about how this could be useful for small island developing states. All right, so simple question. What is UN Biodiversity Lab? We created this free open source platform in 2018 specifically to support policymakers around their commitments to the CBD. The platform provides over 115 global spatial data layers to the governments we work with, and the ability to access them without any GIS expertise. Over the past 2 years, we've grown a deep policy relevant user base with over 300 policymakers active from 61 countries. We also want to use the platform as a way to make spatial data widely accessible to diverse stakeholders, and we've had over 35,000 views of the public site. Moving forward, we're really interested to hear how we can support different user groups and meet their needs. So please send us your feedback and your questions about the platform. All right. So final question, what sets us apart? I'm sure many of you are aware of many different amazing spatial data platforms that are out there, whether it's Resource Watch, Global Forest Watch, World Environmental Situation Room, or many others. We see 4 key areas that set us apart with UN Biodiversity Lab. The first is that through our work to support countries specifically around their commitments to the CBD, we have unique political mandate and relevancy. Second, UNDP and UN Environment's connections provide access to users in diverse countries around the world. Third, we offer private national workspaces to support contextual conservation action. I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. And finally, through these workspaces, we offer a way to engage relevant stakeholders to better share and use data. So I'm going to quickly run you through 5 key features of UN Biodiversity Lab and highlight a few aspects that are particularly relevant for SIDS. So first, through the platform, you can access 116 of the world's best data layers on biodiversity, protected areas, and sustainable development. Now we know that many global data layers are not great for SIDS. They're not high enough resolution, there are issues with cloud cover. However, our spatial data expert Scott Atkinson has worked with numerous SIDS to support them in the preparation of their 6th national report. Up next, he'll share a little bit about the key global data layers that might be most useful to all of you in your work. Second, through the platform, we provide priority access to new NASA data produced on forest cover. This is for a range of countries with tropical forests and include a few SIDS, so we encourage you to check this out. Third, and this really gets to the heart of the site, we offer private national workspaces where countries can upload their national data, invite collaborators, and visualize it in combination with relevant global data. We know from many SIDS that you have high quality national and regional data, and see these private projects as a key way to support you to collect this data and engage with relevant stakeholders in your country in order to compile a database of relevant spatial data for biodiversity action, monitoring, and reporting. Fourth, through using the site, you can conduct basic analyses and create beautiful maps. And fifth, you can use our story maps feature to be able to communicate your conservation successes to diverse user groups. All right, so this was the speediest of speedy overviews. We encourage you to check out a technical training we recently did partnering with NASA ARCIT that dives much deeper into a lot of the issues that I have just covered today. So to wrap up, I just want to talk about what's coming next for us. So working with 5 pilot countries, we're using spatial data to help us identify what we call essential life support areas. These are locations that are essential for both biodiversity and human well-being. And we're working with some of the world's best scientists to help us identify where action can be taken, where nature-based actions can be taken to deliver across national priorities in these areas. On this slide, you can see our first essential life support area map for Costa Rica, which shows where action in the country to protect, manage, restore, and green urban spaces can deliver across 5 priority targets that they identified working with our team. We're continuing to roll out this project throughout the year, and so stay tuned for results from all of our different pilot countries about how they're taking action around their essential life support areas. So with that, I will say thank you and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks so much for that great presentation on spatial data and UN Biodiversity Lab. I see there's quite a lot of questions now in the chat. So before we turn to the Q&A session, I'd like for you to see the presentation of Scott Atkinson on data sets available for the SIDS. And then we will take some time to discuss. I encourage you to start looking at the chat where you have a few questions that may already give you an idea of what we're discussing here. And then we will take a few more questions. We can exchange or read the questions after Scott's presentation. For reminder, Scott is our UNDP Spatial Data Planner. Most of you know him because he's been supporting you with spatial data for the past 2 years. And he's just gonna introduce you to available data sets for the SIDS right now. Scott, over to you.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Scott Atkinson and I'm the spatial planner to the 6th National Report with the UN Development Programme. And I'm also the data manager for the UN Biodiversity Lab platform. I'm in lovely Brisbane, Australia here today. And we're going to have a quick presentation about data that exists on the UN Biodiversity Lab that relates to small island developing states. In this presentation, we're just going to talk about the UN Biodiversity Lab data that's available for small island developing states. I'm gonna break it down in the main issues involving SIDS in geospatial data into 2 categories. There are probably many more, and these 2 categories are rather coarse, but for simplicity, I'm just gonna stick with these for now. So I'm gonna look at these as both a lack of data coverage as well as issues surrounding the spatial resolution of data itself. First is lack of coverage. Even where there's very high resolution data, there's often gaps in that coverage that occur across the world. In one particular area where this occurs quite readily is often in the Pacific. I'm showing you an example of data here. This is actually the global forest cover data. Some of you might be familiar with the Hansen data set. And I'm looking at two countries that are actually relatively close to each other, neighbors within the Central Pacific. Here on the left, we have Fiji. Fiji is showing a very, very good cover from the global forest cover data. Just a reminder, this data does have a 30-meter resolution globally. While Samoa, which is just on the other side of the antimeridian, or the international dateline, doesn't have any coverage. Similarly, many other islands in the Pacific that are just to the east of the 180-degree meridian just don't have global forest cover data at all. It's really only until you get to Hawaii that you again have global forest cover data in this region. So if you notice, you look at Fiji and you see there's coverage of not just the main islands of Viti and Vanuatu, but also some of the smaller islands, Levuka and Kadavu, for example. And it's worth noting that both of these are smaller than, for example, Upolu or Savaii in Samoa, yet they do have coverage of the global forest cover data. So there doesn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason to this, and I have yet to find an explanation for it myself. But it just is meant to really highlight the fact that even within regions in the world, there are gaps in coverage that don't really make sense sometimes. Next, we're going to look at spatial resolution of data. So just because data covers an area doesn't really mean that that data is going to be of much use to some small island, for example. Here we're looking at Sao Tome and Principe and looking at some data of derived species richness metrics. On the left panel we have species richness, and on the right we have rarity weighted richness. And if you look very closely at those maps, you see there's exactly 8 pixels in the country. So that's not very great. That doesn't really help inform much of anything. You can see obviously rarity weighted richness has a much deeper red, which indicates that that those cells are actually quite important. But that's something you would expect in a lot of island nations due to the high level of endemism that we see on islands. So while this data is derived from the IUCN, and there is some currently active work on producing data sets that are higher resolution aggregates of this. Currently on UN Biodiversity Lab, the data we have is quite coarse, although I will again note that there is some works coming in the pipeline that we hope to have available soon that should drastically reduce this. And again, as well, looking at spatial data resolution and noting again, just because data covers an area doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be of much use in a SIDS nation. We can also look sometimes at how poorly the data actually matches shorelines. So on some small islands, these mapping errors can lead to quite significant errors when calculating areas of features, as well as the intersection of these features with, for example, protected area boundaries. Protected area boundaries are often legally defined, so they're generally very high resolution. But they don't necessarily then talk well with other data sets, for example, ecoregions or sometimes even KBAs. And it's important to note that sometimes these data sets that aren't very well aligned with actual shorelines of small countries are sometimes used in official reporting to international agreements. So in the slide you see, in the map you see, this is looking at Cabo Verde, and we are looking at the ecoregions data. And if you look close enough, you can see that there's 2 issues. First of all, there really isn't fine enough resolution in the ecoregions data to probably do justice to the types of habitats that exist or the types of environments that exist in the islands. And you can kind of see that in the fact that there's really only one ecoregion in the entire country. And similarly, if you look at the polygons of those islands, you can see that there's significant shoreline errors. As I'd mentioned, that can lead to significant errors in geospatial analyses. So next, we're just going to look at some of the data available on UN Biodiversity Labs for two SIDS. We're going to look at the Comoros Islands and Trinidad and Tobago, just to kind of see how some of the data we have pertains to countries. So first of all, in Comoros, we're just going to look at the protected areas data. This is coming from the World Database on Protected Areas, and as I just mentioned, this is the legally defined boundaries of protected areas in the country. So this is provided by the government to the WDPA, and so these are generally fairly high quality polygon data sets that are provided. So this is pretty much as good as it generally gets in terms of protected areas, and because these are polygons, they're as high resolution as they are mapped. If we go on to some other data sets, we can look at species richness. So, for example, the map you see here, the yellow to dark red hues are terrestrial threatened species richness, and those that are in the blues to purples are marine species richness, coming from the Aquamaps database. And the things that stand out are that in both cases, the resolution of the data, particularly relative to the size of the islands, is really quite coarse. And so we might ask ourselves, is this at all helpful? We can look at some of the islands here. We can see that there's, for example, 2 pixels that represent threatened species richness on the island, or 3 pixels, or 4 pixels. Is that really helpful? In the marine realm, the data is also even coarser, but that's generally to be expected in the marine realm, simply because the marine realm is a much more difficult realm to map, and there's a much more fluid motion. Not to make a horrible pun. So that's almost potentially to be expected. But we can still ask ourselves, are these actually helpful and for our purposes? And I'll make one note as well. We're looking at the threatened species richness, terrestrial threatened species richness. This data is coming from the IUCN, and there are some data sets at a much higher resolution that are currently in process of being made, but they're not yet available. So we do hope to have these available soon. Looking on next in the Comoros, we're looking at both ecoregions and marine ecoregions, and we can see that in the Comoros, the data is relatively precise. That means it doesn't have really the severe shoreline issues as I pointed out previously, but it still only includes single regions for both data sets. So we can again ask ourselves, is this really helpful? I guess my own perspective is it's not really all that useful, particularly on the terrestrial side of things. Marine realms might be fine for the reasons I mentioned before, but there's surely much better maps to approximate habitat types across the islands. Next, we're going to look at livestock density data from the FAO. So this appears to be a fairly high resolution, and it does tend to cover the islands quite well. And while I'm not a specialist in agronomy or anything of that sort, I reckon it to be a fairly decent data set to use in lieu of any higher resolution national data that may or may not be available. And finally, in Comoros, we're going to look at the global forest cover data, which shows the forest cover as the percent of canopy cover, as well as I'm showing here the year of loss between 2000 and 2018. And we can see that the data covers the islands pretty completely. It's very well matched to the islands. This is derived from Landsat data, so it's approximately 30 megapixel resolution. And it's generally considered to be a pretty solid, robust data set, and it's regularly updated. And as I mentioned, it fully covers the islands. So this would be a very appropriate data set to use potentially for mapping forest cover change on islands over time. So now let's move over to the Southeastern Caribbean, and here we're looking at the protected areas data for Trinidad and Tobago. And similar to the Comoros, this is about as good as it gets. These are the legally defined boundaries of protected areas as provided to the WDPA. So you probably can't expect too much more. This is what you're going to find coming from governments as well. And again, if we look at species richness and TNT, again, the yellow to dark red hues are the threatened terrestrial species richness, and the blues to light purples are marine species richness. The things that stand out again are in both cases the resolution of the data, particularly relative to the size of the islands, might be a little bit better than it was in the Comoros, but it's still relatively coarse. It's still quite coarse. And so we can ask ourselves, is this actually helpful for our purposes? And you might as well make note of the fact that Tobago itself, most of Tobago, doesn't actually have any terrestrial cover. There's 2 pixels up there representing it. And it's worth noting again that there are some data sets coming down the pipeline that should be available soon that are at much higher resolution. So this situation will probably improve in a short amount of time. So if we're looking again at Trinidad and Tobago, looking at ecoregions, that's the land, and marine ecoregions, we can see that in TNT we don't really have the severe shoreline issues that I had pointed out previously, and now there is some differentiation, and we have 3 terrestrial ecoregions in the country, but still a single marine ecoregion. So we can justifiably ask ourselves if that's helpful and sufficient. I think on the terrestrial side, it's certainly better. It does capture mangroves and some of the variation between different habitat types and different ecoregions within Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the marine regions might be fine, but potentially there's going to be some national data to better approximate habitat type across the islands that would be much more useful. Here we're looking at livestock density again from the FAO on Trinidad and Tobago, and as previously mentioned, this is pretty high resolution data and covers the islands well. So in lieu of having higher resolution national data, this is probably a fairly safe data set to use for these purposes. And just as a side joke, it doesn't really tell me where I can go and get the best roti on the island, which is kind of important when thinking about Trinidad and Tobago. And finally, we're going to just look at forest cover data on Trinidad and Tobago, and this is again the global forest cover data. It shows forest cover as the percent canopy closure as well as the year of loss between 2000 and 2018. This is again 30 megapixel resolution derived from Landsat satellite data. And as we can see, it covers the islands pretty completely. This is a data set that's regularly updated and is generally considered to be a pretty solid data set to use. So just to quickly go review what we've kind of gone on, some of the key points I hoped to have made. Global data often does exist, even in small island developing states. But so do gaps. There are often regional gaps, and there are even intra-regional gaps in data. So sometimes even neighboring islands, for example, one island might have high quality data and the other has nothing at all. So there really is no one-size-all-fits approach. Also, shoreline issues can be a significant problem, even with high-resolution data, and this can lead to significant errors in geospatial analyses. And these issues are particularly magnified in the impact that they have and the effect they have by small islands themselves. And it's also worth repeating again that the global shorelines used in many global data sets are not consistent, and that in itself again leads to incorrect boundaries in data. So this leads to all kinds of errors, particularly with small islands. For example, we know, as I pointed out, the ecoregions data almost never lines up exactly with island shorelines, and the small nature of islands just simply magnifies the effects of incorrect boundaries on geospatial calculations. And I'll point out again that new data is going to soon be available on some of the species richness metrics.
Oh, I think we lost the sound, Leah. Great, okay, let's see. I think I had lost the end of the sound. I don't know if everyone lost it as well, but The presentation of Scott was mostly over. And as you understood, it was mostly focusing on the data available for the SIDS. We took Comoros and Trinidad and Tobago mostly because they are the two countries we're giving example in this webinar series. But of course, you can always be in touch with Scott and he will be able to provide access to data for your country. So now that you have in mind the presentation from Annie on UN Biodiversity Lab and Scott on the SIDS, I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. So we do have a lot of questions that came through during the presentations, and thank you for that. Please feel free to add them or to raise your hand. We have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes, let's say, for Q&A, and we'll try to address as many as possible. The first one, and I would like to turn over to Annie for answering this one. We had a question from Turaya Al-Sariri. He works in Oman, and he was asking, how can we be part of Biodiversity Lab, so UN Biodiversity Lab, and use the tool? So Annie, can you enlighten on that? If you're not on mute, it's great.
That always helps. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was great to see the very active chat. So for this question, we recommend anyone go to www.unbiodiversitylab.org. Any user can access all of our global data layers and run some of the basic analyses there. For those of you who work with government or UN in your countries, we would love to connect you to our existing private project spaces for each of the countries that we work with. So if you're in that group, please feel free to email myself or Scott. I put our email addresses in the chat. You can also see Scott's on the screen here. And we will work to connect you to our existing administrator for the national project and see how you might be able to collaborate more with them.
Thank you, Annie. So I hope that that answered the questions. If you have more questions on how to join UN Biodiversity Lab, we're also here for that. So please feel free to ask your questions. We captured a few other questions. I'm just checking there is no hand raised first because I would prefer give the floor to people. So far, so good. We received a question from Ruth Spencer. Ruth, it's great to know you're connected. I miss you. It's great to know that you're following and always motivated to discuss local community and women. And so Ruth's question was, the post-biodiversity strategy going forward calls for the all of the society approach. So what mechanisms are being put in place to include to get the wide contributions of the community stewards and many women of whom, many of whom are women working across many sectors, and how can this be reflected in the national reporting, especially in the Caribbean countries? So that is more maybe a question based on the 6NR project. So the 6NR project for the first time asked that the 6 national report is gender responsive. It was the first time that we had a requirement or a hard push for gender mainstreaming across the report. And it was a bit challenging because most of the countries wanted to report and mainstream gender, but there is no sex disaggregated data available. So if there's no data, obviously it's hard to report on the contribution of both men and women. And that is also an issue for indigenous peoples in general, because there is no indicator to capture the contribution of IPLCs. So what we did was to really push to have a core team working on the 6NR in the country that would be gender balanced. So we make sure that we capture the voices from men and women. We are also encouraging, if you do not have quantitative data, to use qualitative data. So in many countries that we worked with, we actually had case studies or little description on how women especially were contributing in a specific way to monitoring and to conserving biodiversity. When it comes to spatial data itself, the requirement of gender was not necessarily a thing because it's such a brand new topic that we just wanted to make sure countries had access first to spatial data, and then we can come to this question. Well, that being said, you will see in the next presentation is Keisha Garcia, and this woman has been writing the entire 6NR and has been using extensively spatial data and has been connecting with the different agencies to get access to that. So in the future, what we're hoping is to support the countries to get, as we mentioned in the first presentation, to get more indicators that can capture the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities, of women and men, because we want to see the difference in between all of them and the different contributions. And we want to make sure that GIS is not reserved for just a certain type of person, that everyone can access it and use it. And that's why we're trying to build tools like UN Biodiversity Lab to make it accessible even if you're not a GIS expert. So Ruth, I hope this is helping a little bit in the questions you had. Perfect. We had another question. Still checking if someone is raising the hand or not. So far, so good. We had a question though from Susan Davis. And Suzanne, I know you don't have a camera, but I would like to unmute you because we've been in touch before and you have very relevant questions for this webinar. So I'm going to try to unmute you. If your microphone is not working, it's okay. I'll read your question. Susan, can you hear me and can you speak?
Good morning, everyone. I can hear you quite clearly. Are you hearing me?
Perfect. I said that you had a couple of questions and I would want to open the questions to all of the participants. I think they were very interesting and it would be great to capture maybe the thoughts and the experience of other colleagues in the webinar as well.
Okay. Would you like me to read the questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I had two questions. The first one is, where there is existing useful data scattered across different stakeholders, what guidance could be given to stakeholders to get these multiple data sets into formats useful for biodiversity mapping? That was the first question.
So I would like to invite colleagues in this webinar to raise their hand or write any elements of response in the chat. And in the meantime, Annie had provided a few elements for responding to this question. Annie, if you want to share with the group.
Sure, definitely. So as I commented in the chat, I think this is actually a question that can be broken down into two parts. So first, around how do we collect data that's fragmented across different institutions and ministries? And then second, how do we ensure that it's in a usable format? Sorry, the birds are very loud outside my window this morning. So for the first question, that's something that we've worked on a lot through the 6 national reporting process. And we're offering the national projects on UN Biodiversity Lab as a place where this data could be added and made accessible to the user group working directly on the 6 national report. I also know that BioPalma is doing a lot of work with their regional hubs to gather data for specific regions. And this process is, when it comes down to it, is really about stakeholder engagement, which is something that we've really tried to promote throughout the 6 national report, and working to build a base of understanding and the ability to share the information across different institutions. And this is different with every country we work in, and a really important element. The second part of this question was around data format and ensuring that they're compatible. And this one is one that I would love Scott to comment on over email a little bit more. He is definitely the expert who can give a more meaningful answer on this.
Thanks, Annie. Susan, I think you also had another questions on the mapping workshops, right?
Yes, that's correct. That question is, in the planning of mapping workshops involving multiple stakeholders, what would be a recommended strategy in estimating the timeline needed for formatting and sourcing spatial data from the national producers or custodians of biodiversity data? And one of the reasons why there's an interest in this is that we had a challenge when we were doing our 6NR in getting all this data together in time for the deadline set for our national report.
Can you remind me, Suzanne, which country you're working in again?
Oh, I'm from Jamaica.
Thank you. You had mentioned that and I had forgotten. Annie, do you want to just answer on this timing with the workshops?
Yeah, so I can provide an overall answer, but I think it might be also interesting here to hear from some of our other country presenters about how this process worked in their countries. So kind of a broad view is we're starting to work on this process through the Essential Life Support Areas project that I introduced at the end of my presentation. And what we've done there is we've started with a broad inception workshop that's brought together representatives from some of the key institutions in each country working with government, with UNDP, with local academic institutions to make sure that they're aware of our goals with the project and what types of data we need to be able to map these essential life support areas. And then after those workshops close, we're embarking on a several-month process to reach out to all the data holders and see if we can obtain permission to use the data. So this, in Costa Rica, it took maybe 2 or 3 months to get our first cut of national data. But then when we shared this back with our broader group, we came up with a huge long list of more data layers that might be beneficial. So it's been an iterative process of trying to reach out and get better and better data. Similarly for Uganda and Kazakhstan, which we're working with now, we're building in a few months to do that first round of reaching out to try to get data permissions. But I think this varies a lot country to country based on what is needed to secure data permissions. So I think some of our other presenters might also be able to comment on how this process worked in their countries.
Okay, great. Marion, if I may, while I still have the mic, I just wanted to thank you and the rest of the team for this webinar. It is much appreciated, and thank you so much for addressing my questions. You're
very welcome. And then any follow-up is more than welcome. You have our email addresses, and then I can connect you with Scott, Annie, and then we can continue this discussion, of course, after the webinar.
Okay, great.
Thank you. I think that was actually also a good transition for one of the last questions we had. The question was from Shilba, who is recognizing the efforts pushed towards developing digital spatial capacity, but he asking if there is anything being done to help control the quality of the layers to provide the biodiversity information. And that is one question that we have issues with. And I think the next presentation from Trinidad and Tobago will actually be on point on that. In the support that we had so far for the 6 National Report project, indeed, we were not necessarily focusing on creating new data and going on the ground to check the quality of the data and update the data. Mostly because of time constraint and also budget constraint. The team in charge of preparing the report was mostly coordinating to get access to the data that already exists in the country. And that in itself was a big challenge for most of the countries. So for now, our support was on that. We are very conscious about the difficulties in having high quality data, especially for the SIDS, and that is one question we wanted to address in this webinar. And that is something we're working on probably for future support. Henny has been discussing and explaining the Essential Life Support Area project, where we're really focusing on the quality of the data. So in the foreseeable future, this is on the table and this is our goal. Unfortunately, not everything could be addressed during the 6NR project, but it's a very good question, and we're hoping we can support further countries with that. So thank you everyone for your questions. That was a lot of questions. Please keep them going in the chat. We are happy to take them. We're taking note of them. In the meantime, I think we can move forward with actually another really interesting presentation because today we're going to learn from the example of Trinidad and Tobago. And We're going to go from the global level to a very concrete example in the country. So today the presentation will be made by Keisha Garcia, who is with us this morning and will be able to answer your question. Keisha has a global career spanning over 17 years, and she focuses on sustainable development issues, principally those related to biodiversity and ecosystem services. She has extensive experience in undertaking biodiversity research and in using research to help inform policy, governance, and decision-making. Keisha supported the preparation of the 4th, 5th, and 6th national reports for Trinidad and Tobago to the CBD. And she's also involved in efforts to bridge the science policy interface around biodiversity issues. So Keisha, you now have the floor. We're going to see your presentation and open the floor for questions after that.
So thank you and good morning, colleagues. My name is Keisha Garcia and I serve as the National Biodiversity Planning and Reporting Specialist for the preparation of Trinidad and Tobago's 6th National Report to the Convention on Biological Diversity. But just very quickly before starting today, I would like to thank the UNDP for the opportunity to make this presentation on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. As a part of implementing the 6th National Report process here in Trinidad and Tobago, there were some very important insights that we were able to identify, a number of which are especially relevant for SIDS. And so we are therefore very happy to have a chance to speak about these today. My presentation today will be focused on our 6th National Reporting process and some of the lessons that we've learned, especially in relation to data accessibility and applicability. So just to provide a background, we had a very well-organized process here in Trinidad and Tobago with some strong technical and administrative leadership. We were led by the local UNDP office and our Ministry of Planning and Development. We had a national steering committee that was convened and comprised of members with strong technical backgrounds. We had strong involvement and cooperation from all of our main stakeholder groups. And we attempted all 7 sections of the 6th National Report, although we were cognizant that we were not able to complete certain sections in full detail, such as the one on indigenous knowledge and local contributions to biodiversity management, simply because we don't have the data. But the 6th NR wasn't without its challenges here in Trinidad and Tobago. Some of those are persistent challenges and some were in fact quite specific to the 6th NR process. And I'm just going to highlight some of those now. Our revised National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which includes our national targets, were only approved by our cabinet in April of 2018, and that gave us a very short monitoring time frame in order to prepare our 6th National Report. As well, the 5th National Report, which was a very comprehensive report, was completed in October of 2016, and we had very limited new data to work with for the 6th National Report. Then we had the issue of the new expectations and requirements that were a part of the 6th National Report, especially related to spatial data and gender-related data, which we had to come to terms with. And we have had a persistent challenge here relating to biodiversity data collection in Trinidad and Tobago because our clearinghouse is not fully populated or maintained, meaning that I had to go as the person leading this process to every agency individually to try to collect whatever the data and information they have. Now, what I want to reflect on are some of the lessons that we learned here in Trinidad and Tobago, not only from the 6th National Report, but also from foregoing reports, such as the 5th and 4th reports. And these could help to address some of the challenges that we are facing in our national reporting process. One of the most salient lessons we learned is that national policy priorities should really establish the foundation for biodiversity goals and targets, and that global framework should be retrofitted to these national policy priorities, not the other way around. Why do I say that? Well, because here in TNT, there was a very early attempt to cover all of the global IG targets and to develop national targets and indicators against these. But the result was a list of 20 targets and 97 accompanying indicators. And the fifth national report back in 2016 identified that Trinidad and Tobago simply did not have the data to monitor or measure the greater majority of these. There was therefore an attempt in our revised NBSAP to reduce this list and to prioritize targets and indicators most relevant for Trinidad and Tobago. But again, even through this process, which was widely consultative, the policy priorities were not brought sharply into focus. And so even our truncated list that existed within the NBSAP for our national targets were not a true reflection of our national priorities. And we also gave inadequate attention to the systems for monitoring and evaluating within the NBSAP for the priorities we identified. The overall result is that in the 6th NR, we were unable to provide a comprehensive assessment of progress against our national targets, even the prioritized ones. So in moving forward, what was therefore recommended is that TNT focuses on 3 main drivers or threats to our local biodiversity. And these have been identified since the 5th national report as land use and land cover change, which is a top priority for most SIDS, if not all, adaptation to climate change, which is another SIDS priority, and unsustainable use of our local biodiversity resources, which affects, again, most if not all SIDS. These are drivers for which we have comprehensive and relatively long-term data sets, so the threats are well established and relatively well understood. What has been discussed and what we need to move towards here in TNT is the establishment of our local biodiversity goals and targets based on these 3 priorities, especially considering where there may be intersections between and amongst them, because these intersections could allow us to identify critical entry points for policy, meaning that we could potentially create multiplier effects in the interventions that we design. We would thereby reduce our monitoring effort, and by extension, evaluation and reporting could become far more onerous and far more streamlined. But let me say that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has already begun to move in this direction. There are efforts to improve land use through the design of a more holistic policy approach that encompasses both biodiversity and climate change considerations at its core. And there have also been more concerted efforts to improve our system of managing protected areas through the design and implementation of a number of policy support tools and metrics. Trinidad and Tobago is undoubtedly, we are on the right trajectory, but what is needed is a little pep in our step. We need to move faster to keep up with the rate of intensification of our drivers. This is the main problem. I want to switch now to speak about another lesson that we have learned over the years, one which relates to the type of data and information that are most relevant from the reporting and decision-making standpoints. So I'll begin this section by looking at the positives, the things that we are already doing in TNT. But what I wish to do as I move along is to point out what we have identified as further needs. So if you look at some of our previous national reports, you will realize that there are certain indicators for which we have very good baselines and strong historic data. And many of these do in fact correspond with the priorities that have been identified, those that I spoke about earlier. So here we have the change in total forested area in Trinidad since 1970, and that's tracked nearly annually. Here we have the area covered by our plantation forests, tracked since 1990 on an annual basis. We also track our mean long-term annual temperature. As you can see, it's increasing here in Trinidad and Tobago. And in Trinidad, we do in fact have some good spatial data for some of our indicators. So here you see a land use or land cover map that was updated in 2007, and we do have a corresponding map for Tobago. Here we have a recently updated protected areas map generated by the government in 2018. Now, we have some good applied data sets in Trinidad as well. But a part of the challenge that we face with our applied data sets relate to keeping these up to date. So here we have a tracking of our land use between 1991 and 2010, and it's expressed spatially, so you could see the change in different human uses over time. Here you see the evolution of Trinidad and Tobago's urban footprint between 1991 and 2010, growing substantially, I should say. This map is this graph, is a graph that shows the forest outturn from our natural forest between 2010 and 2014. And what this is showing us is the extent to which logging is illegally occurring in our natural forests. So from this, we can directly track the impact of deforestation on some of our most biologically rich habitats. This chart here shows you the way that fire is affecting some of our ecosystems, and these data are far more important than simply having a log of the number and sizes of fires that are occurring nationally. This tells us about the direct impact of a human-induced activity on different types of ecosystems, especially ones like our natural forests. This chart here shows us the change in freshwater withdrawal as a percentage of the total renewable freshwater resources in Trinidad and Tobago, indicating the impact that we are having on some of our local resources and the ability of our local natural resources to keep up with our demand, in this case, fresh water. Okay, this final map here is an ecosystem services map which spatially expresses the extent of coastal protection afforded by the coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds in Tobago's southwestern area. The map has directly been used in decision-making about where and how physical development should occur in this area of Tobago. And this is an area which is very popular for both tourism activities and the development of housing and other infrastructure. The idea in showing you all of this data is to show what we consider to be most useful from a decision-making standpoint. But what I want to emphasize after showing you those data sets is that while we are in fact on the right track, we need to ensure that data and information that underpin decision-making are updated systematically so that we have greater confidence in the interventions being prescribed. Of course, once this is done, you can imagine that national reporting would become quite a bit less onerous. But this perhaps is easier said than done. And this is because, like most small island states, Trinidad and Tobago lacks the capacity to monitor and collect environmental data. And this is a relatively widespread and persistent problem for which there are no easy solutions. Now, it might be worth mentioning very quickly here that in TNT, we do have a National Environmental Fund known as the Green Fund, and that capitalizes on a tax that is mandatory for all registered businesses. Last count, this fund held $880 million US. So we do have an opportunity here to fund some of the work that we need. But there are amendments in the law and in administration of the fund that will be required to allow for monies to be redirected to support the type of research that we need to meet our national biodiversity goals and targets. I can't say too much about this right now because I think I'm already almost out of time. So what I want to speak a little bit now about is addressing the issue of scale in the collection and application of data, especially for SIDS, because like many SIDS, Trinidad and Tobago faces this problem. The chart that I've included on this slide shows a map that was generated by the UN Biodiversity Lab for use in our 6th national report, and it expresses the protected areas in Trinidad and Tobago based on data sets accessed globally. Now, when you compare this map with what I would have showed you in slide 15, there are a few discrepancies. And what this highlighted for us in Trinidad and Tobago is that our geographical scale is so small that global spatial data sets will often not provide the level of accuracy that is desirable, meaning, therefore, that we need to find ways of investing in the generation of spatial data that is more locally applicable. And again, Trinidad and Tobago is on the right track, but more work is certainly required. In this map here, I show you the value of carbon sequestration services from our forest and coastal ecosystems. This was done as a part of the Pro-EcoServe project undertaken in Trinidad between 2010 and 2015 under the overall aegis of the UN Environment. And it uses a combination of local and global data to try to generate the most accurate map possible. These maps are from a different project led by the University of the West Indies. The project was known as Golo-Kasi. And what these maps show is the change in distribution of vascular plants across Trinidad based on climate modeling. And what the scientists did here was that they used the IPCC AR5 models and they downscaled the temperature and rainfall data for Trinidad. And then they overlaid the most recent floral data from an in-depth local study on vascular plants to look at how the distribution of these plants would change under various climate scenarios. But this type of data is really what gets to the heart of decision-making on climate change adaptation measures that are required locally, including the designation of protected areas. So similarly, under the same Golo-Kasi project, these maps here were done using downscale climate data for Trinidad, and they consider the impact of various climate change scenarios on an important agricultural crop in Trinidad, cocoa or Theobroma cacao. But not surprisingly, at the higher RCPs or representative concentration pathways, and these are the temperature changes, we expect to see greater impacts on the ability to grow this crop locally. This potentially affects many local farmers who depend on cocoa sales for their livelihoods. Now in this slide, the global climate models were used to consider the impact of sea level rise on a beach in northeastern Trinidad that is considered a critical nesting ground for leatherback turtles. And what it shows is that under certain climate models, the entire beach could be expected to be inundated and lost, and this would have devastating consequences for turtle nesting and the associated local livelihood. Now, the 6NR process also allowed us to consider additional types of data sets and support that are required to improve our decision-making and actions related to the biodiversity here in TNT. I specifically want to highlight the importance of platforms such as the UN Biodiversity Lab in this regard. This map that I show was generated for us by the lab, showing the spatial distribution of our threatened species. And this is a major gap in our local data collection. In discussions with local stakeholders, we identified that maps such as these are critical in helping to manage our biodiversity. But at present, we do not have these types of data at our scale. Recognizing that it will take quite a bit of time for us to generate the necessary data, one important thing that we did was to use the UN Biodiversity Lab to start the conversation about how to collect and use these types of data locally. And it's on this point that I want to highlight that platforms such as the UN Biodiversity Lab offer SIDS a wonderful opportunity to improve our data banks, especially spatial data, where these data are locally lacking. The lab could provide technical support, and it could also help to facilitate the exchange of data and information and expertise, whether this be between local and global stakeholders or even amongst local stakeholders who don't usually speak with each other. So some final thoughts. The first is that SIDS present an opportunity for such studies at a smaller scale, and we are like laboratories. So we can undertake studies in our SIDS that have the opportunity for transfer and adaptation, even upscaling in certain instances. But I want to emphasize one of my earlier points about having clearly defined national policy priorities on which to develop targets, because this would help to make biodiversity monitoring, reporting, and management more efficient and streamlined, rather than going the other way around, where small islands and countries in general are always chasing after changing global agendas. Now, it would also help, in addition, let me say here quickly, to save some time, money, and effort, because we found that in our 6th national report, the gender perspective was not as important to Trinidad and Tobago as in other places. But once we understood this, we were able to relate to the CBD what we were willing to cover based on our local circumstances. The next point is that don't wait for perfect data. Start the conversation with the best available science that you have. And such as in the case with the data we got from the UN Biodiversity Lab, use what you have to begin discussions about policies and actions. And the last point is, it is very important, especially in SIDS, to have a central repository for data and information, such as a clearinghouse, because this does increase efficiency of the process for national reporting. And it does help to underpin a strong biodiversity portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha, for that presentation. That was great and very insightful. Thank you for all your work on this and more generally on the 6NR. So I would like to open the floor to Q&A because we received a lot of questions for the global level and support from UNDP and UNEP. We have Keisha with us this morning, and I would be curious to see if any of the colleagues here have questions for Keisha on the experience for writing national reports, because she wrote the 4th, 5th, and 6th, and also on the use of spatial data in terms of engaging with stakeholders in the country. So please feel free to raise your hand or write your questions. I think it's a good opportunity to engage with your peer here. And so Keisha, you have a comment from Susan who says comprehensive presentation from Trinidad and Tobago is appreciated. So thanks again for giving this presentation. I will wait just a tiny bit for people to ask their questions and raise their hands if they have any question. And in the meantime, Keisha, not to put you on the spot, but if you do have comments based on the questions that came during the session and you would like to add anything to your presentation, feel free to open your microphone and discuss with us.
So thank you, Marianne. There was an earlier question from my colleague in Jamaica about getting your different stakeholders to speak and then being able to bring that data together and use it spatially. So I just wanted to say that, well, in our case, in the preparation of the 6th national report, I just want to make it clear that we didn't actually undertake to develop new data, new spatial data. We used what was already available. But one of the mechanisms that our government, through our Ministry of Planning and Development, has been looking into is the establishment of a national GIS platform where they do hope to be able to generate better spatial data around environmental issues and other issues, planning issues. So a steering committee was in fact put together back in 2018, I believe. And there was some initial thinking that went into it, but unfortunately it didn't progress as they had hoped. But I do know that there are talks to get this back up and running and to ensure that Trinidad and Tobago in the future can in fact be able to generate a little bit more of its own spatial data for use locally. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. That's a very great point, and I think that resonates and echoes with a lot of participants today who work in the context of the SIDS and the need to update and having spatial data may be more accurate in some countries. So thank you for that. We have another comment from Dion Newell who says, great presentation from Trinidad and Tobago, thank you. But I do not think that at this stage we have more questions. So I will give just a couple of more seconds to participants to raise their hands or type their questions if they want to, and if they have any. You can also see on your screen the email from Keisha. While Keisha is a very busy person, feel free also to contact her if you have more specific questions on this. And I kind of remind you that we will post her presentation on the Livestock forum, and you can follow up from there. So if we do not have any more questions, I will turn over to then the last presentation. One point that I wanted to let you know also is that we had another session for this webinar in the Pacific early this morning. So that was covering Africa and the African region and the Pacific region. That was approximately at 2 a.m. our time in the Caribbean, so we obviously did not follow this one, but we had a presentation from Dr. Ahmed Ouledi from Comoros on how they use also spatial data for the 6NR. So just for you to know that you will receive also a second presentation, a second example of how a country has been using spatial data to monitor and report on biodiversity. All right, so now we have, okay, I'm just reading the last comment from Marcia Tinto, who said, thank you, Keisha, very holistic presentation. I underscore your point for the need for a clearinghouse, a central repository for data. Thank you for that comment, Marcia. So now, last but not least, last presentation today, I want to turn over to Lige Kai, that most of you surely know. Lige is a program management officer at CBD Secretariat and works on national reporting, NBSAP, and monitoring and reviewing the implementation of the convention. Lige has been working with the CBD Secretariat since 2001 and has been providing support to parties since then. And as a result of his efforts, the number of national reports submitted drastically increased, as 192 countries have submitted a 5th national report, and 165 countries have submitted their 6th national report so far. So Lige is with us today. Thank you, Lige. We are going to have your presentation first and then open the floor for questions. So over to you, Lige.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all well and safe during this challenging time. I'm Lige Kai from CBD Secretariat. I'm taking care of national reporting and planning at CBD Secretariat. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank colleagues from UNDP and UNEP, particularly Marion, for organizing this webinar for small islands developing states, which have been facing challenges in the monitoring and reporting on the implementation of the convention and its strategic plan. We believe that this webinar is important while we're starting a new decade and discussing how we're going to address challenges ahead. Today, I would like to share updates on the process of developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the key recommendations from the thematic consultation on monitoring, reporting, and reviewing of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, held in February this year and in Rome, Italy. It is our hope that this introduction will provoke thoughts about how the monitoring, reporting, and reviewing system under the convention could be enhanced to strengthen the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First of all, I would like to share an update on the process of development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. COP15, held in Egypt in November 2018, adopted a decision 14/34, which established an open-ended working group to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Co-chairs were designated to lead the process under the supervision of COP Bureau. Mr. Bazil from Canada and Mr. Ogawa from Uganda were appointed as co-chairs. In addition, SUBSTA, SBI, and Working Group on Article 8J were requested to contribute to the development of the post-2020 biodiversity framework within their respective mandates. The decision covers various aspects of the process, including the principles, requirements for documentation, and communication. Among others, the decision encouraged all relevant stakeholders to contribute to the relevant consultation undertaking at the various levels. A few other decisions adopted by COP14 also provide guidance for developing relevant elements of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, such as mainstreaming, capacity development, and resource mobilization. But I will not go into the details of these decisions. I only focus on the 14/34. So what has happened so far? The first regional consultation began in January 2019, and so far all the regions have had their own consultations. Meanwhile, a number of the thematic consultations have been organized to address specific issues important for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, such as resource mobilization, capacity development, ecosystem restoration, synergies among the related multilateral environmental agreements. There are also a few other consultations organized by relevant organizations and stakeholders, such as those organized by IUCN, FAO, and OECD. More importantly, the working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework has had its own, two meetings so far, one in August of 2019 and another one in February 2020. Based on the inputs from the first meeting, the co-chairs had prepared a zero draft of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework for negotiation at second meeting. Based on the proposals and the views received from the second meeting, the co-chairs now are preparing the first draft of the framework and will present it for the further negotiation at third meeting, originally planned for July, but now probably will be postponed to the January or February of next year. OEWG2 also requested SBTi 24 and SBI 3 to provide further inputs to the development of the global biodiversity framework, such as baseline for setting targets, indicators for monitoring progress, and monitoring, reporting, and review mechanism. What is coming next? We still have a lot to do. First, more thematic consultations are being organized or going to be organized, such as on sustainable use, the role of cities and subnational governments, and of course, mostly through the virtual meetings due to the pandemic. So as said that above, the SBTi 24 and SBI 3, which are most likely to be held in the October of this year, will provide the more inputs to the developments of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework by addressing specific issues requested from OEWG2. Then OEWG3 will continue negotiating the first draft of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Then the co-chairs will present the outcome from OEWG3 to COP15 for the final consideration and adoption. In between, a few important meetings will provide a strong push to the process, such as the United Nations Summit on the Biodiversity to be held in September this year in connection with the United Nations General Assembly, and the General Assembly of IUCN to be held in January of next year. So, what are the goals and targets or content in the zero draft may be interested to the SIDS. you know that I haven't got a chance to look at the latest draft being prepared by co-chairs. So I only can present something from the zero draft, which was presented to the OEWG2 earlier. And also I want you to know that the wording on these slides are the summary or the extracts I did from the text of the zero draft. Is not exactly the wording in the zero draft. I know that there are a number of the proposed long-term goals and action targets that may be particularly interesting to the small islands developing states. These are the targets related to the marine protect areas, control of invasive alien species, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. And you will see here, one of the action targets for 2030 is to protect at least 30% of the marine areas by 2020. So this is a very critical target for small islands countries. And I also wish to inform you that a group of small island developing states have formed a coalition to speak for SIDS at the negotiation and highlighting the challenges faced by SIDS on the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular the resources, capacity development, and monitoring and reporting. Next, I would like to share some recommendations that emerged from the Somatic consultation on the monitoring, reporting, and reviewing held in February this year in Rome. The consultation had a mix of the presentations, group, and plenary discussions covering all the existing elements of the review approaches under the convention, including national biodiversity planning, national reporting, indicators, voluntary peer review, and a number of the related conventions and organizations like UNFCCC, UNDESA, WTO, OECD were invited to introduce their approaches or practices in the monitoring, reporting, and reviewing. And probably the CBD will draw the inspiration from their approaches and try to see how they could improve the approaches of monitoring and reporting, reviewing in this convention. With regard to the national planning for post-2020 period, all countries were encouraged to adopt targets and commitments in line with the post-2020 biodiversity framework. To ensure alignment of national and global targets, all countries and stakeholders encouraged to register commitments in line with the global biodiversity framework. And also consultation online the need for countries to complete the revision of their MBSAPs quickly so that it gave more time for implementation. And the consultation also suggested standardized guidance provided for the revision of the MBSAP so that, to help to identify gaps in commitments and facilitate monitoring and implementation. And also country highlighted the importance of allocated resources for implementation of MBSAP. For national reporting, countries stressed that the national report should continue to be the main instruments. And then for the next decade, countries I expect to submit the 2 regular reports, probably complemented with the voluntary update review reports to be submitted every 2 years. And national reports should focus on those content that will be used for global review and stock taking, such as progress towards the global targets and goals. And then some countries suggest that using a common set of indicators for reporting to allow comparability and global aggregation. Country also highlight the importance of increasing synergies in reporting to related conventions. For a global review, and 2 global stop talking were proposed, one probably in 2024 or 2025, focusing on identifying the commitment gaps and then the actions needed. And the other one probably in 2028 to further enhance the implementation. So SBI 3 will pilot an open-ended forum where a number of countries will be invited to share their progress in the implementation of strategic plan for 2011 to 2020. So if this forum proves working well, the COP15 could adopt this as one of the review approaches, and the future meetings of SBI will probably provide an opportunity to all countries to present their reviews or review updates. And of course, the purpose of such review is going to facilitate mutual learning among the parties and enhance the implementation. Countries also suggested strengthening the voluntary peer review, in particular getting more countries volunteered to be reviewed, and the findings from the reviews will be used for global planning and global decision making. Some countries propose the establishing bodies, such as Implementation Support Committee, to review the quality of the MBSAPs and national reports. So we know that the SIDS have particular challenges in this regard, monitoring and reporting, and because we know that a number of small island developing states have not completed their MBSAPs and 6 national report in time. So this could be the constraints in the resources and capacities, and could also be lack of the monitoring system and the data management system. So we hope you will highlight these needs for capacity development and resources in the relevant future discussions. To let you know that the report of the Somatic consultation held in Rome is available on the CBD website. And if you have time, you can look at the report, and some of detailed recommendations are there. And maybe you could look at them and think about how you're going to enhance this and make proposals and suggestions at the future meeting to enhance the monitoring, reviewing, and reporting under the convention. That's all from me. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Great, thank you, Lige. Thank you very much. I am happy to know that Lige, you're with us today. And therefore, I would like to open the floor for any potential questions from our participants on your presentations, or any questions they may have on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or anything related to the work with the CBD Secretariat. So participants, this is the last presentation, and so I'm inviting you to raise your hand or write your question to communicate with us if you have any question, and take advantage of the fact that we have a project manager with us from the CBD Secretariat. I'm giving just a couple of more seconds to participants to raise their hands if they have anything to add. Lige, I think you're with us still, and yes. I want to offer you the possibility to add anything from your perspective and the CBD Secretariat's perspective based on what we've heard today and the questions from the country. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, everyone, again. Before we answer any questions, I just have a small correction to my presentation just made now. As the dates of the Substat 24 and SBI 3, I said in presentation it's October now. At that time when I record this, it's not decided yet, and now it's decided. It will be in the first week of, first and 2 weeks of November now. But you know that these dates are still, not finalized, because this, the things might evolve due to the situation of pandemic. And personally, I hope that it will be in November, but we'll see. So I'm happy to answer any question you have. If we don't have enough time, we can answer the questions by email. There is no problem at all. So any questions?
I do not see any questions for now. I'm offering again just one last time the participants the possibility to raise their hand or type their questions in the chat. You do see Lige's email address on the screen, so also feel free to reach out to him if you have any questions. I know some of the SIDS have not yet been able to submit their 6NR for diverse reasons. So we are here, and Lige is here also to make sure that you succeed in this. But at this stage, I do not see any questions. And so I think we're getting close to the end of this webinar. Before I close this webinar, I would want to ask a little favor to everyone. And I would like to take a picture of all the participants today. So whoever is presentable, I would want to see your faces, and please turn on the camera. Leah, if you can stop sharing for now. Just to see, we have over 65 participants, I think, right now, and we've had more than 80 people joining us today. So if everyone can turn their camera on, and I'm just going to take a screenshot of our participants. All right, so I'm going to count to 3 and then see how many people can turn on the camera. I see more people coming in. All right, 1. Actually, let me have more people joining, so I'm giving a bit more time for people to turn on the camera. Sorry, we were not ready for that. I know, but okay, a few more people. All right, I'm gonna take this picture at 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna take another picture with another slide because there's a lot of participants. And the last one. Thank you very much, everyone. Wonderful. And we will be sharing this with colleagues when sharing our presentation. And with this, we're about to conclude this webinar. So first, thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Prudence Rain and Anthony Camel, Annie Vernick, Scott Atkinson for their presentation. Thank you, of course, Keisha, for sharing your experience and lessons learned in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, thank you very much, Lige, for being with us this morning, taking the time and sharing updates on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. If everyone, of course, I want to thank Diego Choa and Leah Phillips, who are helping me managing this webinar, the backstage. So thank you very much for your support. And if you have any questions, you see on the screen that I have 2 email addresses for Diego and myself, and please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any question. I see there is a question in the chat from Lisa. Yes, this is recorded indeed, and that's a perfect transition to my concluding remarks. All of the videos and the presentations will be posted on the NBSAP forum, and I also encourage you to discuss and continue the discussion one more time on this topic on spatial data and the SIDS in the section dedicated for it on the NBSAP forum, and Diego, I think, is going to drop the link in the chat. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions on the 6NR on spatial data. I'll be happy to connect you with Annie and Scott. Feel free to email Lige, and I hope you can keep exchanging between peers. In the meantime, I wish you to have a great day, stay healthy, and I hope we'll talk soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.